Okay, we're going to begin. Good morning. It's July 27, 2015. This is the Planning Committee of the Council. With me is Council members Terry Borneman and Dan Hamill. And this morning we have one item before us. It's the new construction and character issues in historic residential districts. Let's see. Presenting will be Rick Sepler.
Good morning, Council members. What I'd like to do today is to frame an issue that has come before the Council regarding character, talk about some of the antecedents of that created the issue itself, and talk about potential remedies. We do not, of course, have a fully developed solution set at this point, but we have a process we'd like to propose for you to consider that would lead us to a resolution. As the council members are aware, a number of neighborhood groups and individual residents have expressed concern regarding new construction in historic districts, specifically that the new construction itself is dissimilar and not complementary or supportive of the historic context. Outsize, outscale, doesn't relate well, and enough intrusion of new development could adversely affect the historic character. This is not an issue that is unique to Bellingham. It's an issue that's faced in most districts that have residential components and have infill potential, and there are a variety of solutions to deal with it. I'll frame some of the background on this. As the council members are aware, since 2005, the city has been very proactive in its response to establishing historic districts and acknowledging the existing historic character of many of the neighborhoods in Bellingham itself. Our historic districts largely are to help memorialize and identify the characteristics that we value. They are typically not regulatory. In essence, they don't come back and say you can't do this or you can do this. But they do establish a context, and in a way it relied on participation by residents to help maintain that character. Folks aware they're in a historic district might seek out additional guidance, would have access to additional funding in terms of preserving their historic structures itself. And a number were established through the Historic Preservation Ordinance. Additionally, many of these areas that did have historic homes were threatened by the potential of losing those homes, in the sense that if multifamily development were allowed as a replacement use, often you lose the historic structures below for higher and better use of land. And through council action, both in 2006 and 2008, in a couple of the neighborhood areas that have historic districts or historic assets, the areas were downzoned with specific intent of trying to preserve those character as they go forward. In 2006, the city began applying for grants, and the intent of that was to conduct a survey and inventory. And that was the first comprehensive look at the historic resources and assets the city has. Although they were noted historically, it's important to sort of get a compendium of them to understand their scope and intent, to characterize what are those key elements that make the district whole, or a potential district whole, and to use that information both as an educational function and potentially in the future as a legislative function to address issues associated with them. The second goal, of course, of that initiative was to look for properties that were eligible for listing on both the local or national register, and Bellingham does have a number of residences that do qualify, and they're substantial and have been identified through the process itself. In terms of our current standards right now, in residential areas we have bulk and scale. Bulk and scale is typically setbacks, lot coverage, maximum height. It creates a building envelope, a box, if you will. Most cases, folks don't build out to the box, but it does define those areas that are allowed for development. I should take a step back to say that at the time of crafting bulk and sale regulations, it was largely thought that very few residences would ever max out the envelope. It was a unique aspect. Although recently we've seen a change in the average home size, both nationwide and in the city, where they've actually started to decline again. You could say from the period from 1970 through 2000 was characterized with growth of average home size. And areas that were never countenanced to have full build-out are actually achieving full build-out. The economic recession has altered that to some degree, and home sizes have declined nationally and again have declined in Bellingham. The intent was that with the suite of bulk and scale regulations, lot coverage, height, side yard setback, rear yard setback, you'd have a limitation on form itself. Nonetheless, it is possible to construct homes that would be fairly substantial, and I could understand the concern, as could my colleagues, of smaller homes being dwarfed by the large home that would go in, and the loss of continuity on the area itself. It's important to note that it's difficult to regulate on maximum home size, in a sense, because that also sometimes goes counter to other goals the city has. Additionally, establishing that metric of what that number would be somewhat difficult because the neighborhoods, as noted in the memorandum, are eclectic. We have large homes on the same block as small homes. And while there might be a general characterization of smaller homes, the real issue, it appears to us, is the character of the street, the building at the street line itself. What most communities do, rather than restrict the size, is they sculpt the envelope to achieve their end. And it protects the city against the argument that you've taken value and you've limited use, but it does achieve an end by preserving the character of the area of the streetscape. Sculpting might include a step back, meaning that the first 20 feet of any new structure has to be 2 stories or less if 3 stories were allowed, for example, or additional width on the side, or a relationship to the lot width, to the width of the homes. There are a variety of approaches. Typically, the way to find that is to look at the existing area and seeing those characteristics and say which tool would replicate that kind of street scale, but still allow for modern development to occur, but in character and in keeping with the context of the area itself. So typically requiring the massive scale new construction be consistent with the majority of surrounding homes can be achieved through bulk and scale regulations. Bulk and scale is prescriptive. Prescriptive meaning you'd read in the zoning code, and you'd follow it, and we'd achieve an end. Design guidelines can be used to supplement that. Typically guidelines are recommendations, standards or requirements. Usually the first intervention is to do the bulk and scale requirements and say, are we getting the end we're looking for? Then if there's specific information that needs to be incorporated in new development, for example, many communities are favored by front porch design, and whole streets are characterized by those special front porches that are typical of development. A guideline which could almost become a standard is you need to do a front porch to match the other development that's on the area itself. Even new construction could accommodate that. Additionally, you can look at the lot widths themselves and acknowledge that there's a proportionality between the width of the lot and the width of the building. And what that usually results in is you can carry greater mass towards the rear of the lot. In essence, if you're looking for a bigger home, there are artful ways of arranging the space towards the rear, and we found good success in other communities by allowing that to be the direction. Streetscapes preserved, mass can be accommodated, folks could build the size of homes they wish to have to accommodate modern lifestyles. I should note in Port Townsend, the challenge in many of the historic homes there at that period of construction, none have closets, none had internal plumbing, and none had internal heating source other than a fireplace. So clearly there needs to be some reasonable adaptation for those accommodations, which we require now. We can ensure that floor-to-floor heights are similar. Again, that could be a prescriptive standard that will require it, and that does line up, especially in some of the neighborhoods we have, to provide greater continuity. And we could require that a context-based height be used so that you're not more than 1 story taller than adjacent homes or homes on the block itself, and that provides for continuity. There tends to be a one-story rise and fall on most block faces as it goes forward. I have included a separate memorandum that shows how some of those approaches could be used, just to help flesh them out, so you can see the kind of nature we'd be looking at. They're very simplistic in terms of the diagrams provided, but it does give a flavor of the kind of approaches we would investigate more fully. We would suggest that we start with phase one, if council believes this is appropriate and warrants work to occur. That would be to assess the existing historic development patterns, find out what those characteristics are we're looking to preserve to make sure we're striving for it, get confirmation of that. Develop revised bulk and dimensional standards and any prescriptive design standards that would go with them for consideration to achieve that end. Go through full review. Obviously, this would be an amendment to the zoning code at a future date and involve public participation and discussion, and then obviously implement and muster. We'd say that guidelines might very well be a separate phase. You'd want to see if you're able to achieve your end. And the approach there is you use the minimum regulatory technique necessary to achieve the public good, and you monitor and saying, are we getting the outcomes we need? And then you come back and say, if we need more teeth or a better process, you can add those in specifically. The matter before this council committee and for council to consider is whether the issues are significant enough at this time to warrant development of these regulations. And if so, we would suggest that we would consider you would recommend to us considering adding the phase one approach to the 2016 work plan. So I've covered this pretty briefly. I think the memo was pretty thorough on the matter, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have on the issues before us.
Okay, thanks, Rick. I think what I'll do is just open up to the committee for questions. Got any? Dan first.
So what I'm trying to understand here is I think what the trigger event that brought this issue forward was the development or the proposed development of 3 large houses in a single-family neighborhood in the York neighborhood on the 1600 block of Iron Street that were sold to the permitting process as 5-bedroom homes plus 2 bonus rooms. And these homes are really designed for student housing and not for family housing. If the math is correct, these homes would go for about $44,000 a year in rent, which a working family wouldn't be able to necessarily afford. So what I'm trying to understand is how do we regulate that from happening? Because I think this upsets the historic nature of neighborhoods that are surrounding Western, Seahome, York, et cetera. So I'm trying to understand how we get to that. And to me, this proposal, which is very well crafted, while it's very well crafted, does not rise to that level. So I'm trying to understand how we can get to that.
Just to interject something, and I think Rick has a great explanation for how it would work. There's the design standards or the Vulcan scale issue, which would apply all over, and then there's potential illegal use, and I think that's what Rick can talk to you about, which is to us right now is separate. That's an individual's issue that we need to address, and it's being addressed. And then there's the overall issue about how neighborhoods look and how we infill in an appropriate way to not destroy neighborhood character.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say, if I might, and
Wait,
if Terry, if you'd like to add on,
yeah.
and perhaps I can answer both at the same time.
Well, yeah, is mine does, because I actually think the illegal, what we perceive as illegal uses, the use of boarding homes in single-family neighborhoods, for me, is a greater concern than the bulk and size. We have, in my neighborhood, kitty corner from us, a house that at first we thought was going to be one of those because it maxed it out at 5,000 square feet in a neighborhood of small craftsmen. But we lucked out that the developer's wife decided she wanted to live there, but she used to live in that neighborhood, and they designed it such that they put elements on the front, even though it's much bigger than the houses around it, with design elements that fit within a craftsman kind of neighborhood, and with nice landscaping and stuff, so you don't even notice that it's that big. So we can get around those if we have the right elements. But the illegal use, and that was our concern, that they were going to maybe try to use this as a boarding house. That, to me, is, and what I hear from neighbors, an issue that should probably be tackled maybe even before the design part. The design part's important, but for a lot of the old neighborhoods, that issue is paramount, and at least it is for me. The other is important as well, but just so that ties. I just wanted it ties in with his.
There are two issues that were brought forward.
Yeah.
One is a use-based issue, which is an enforcement issue and an administrative issue that we're pursuing. And that issue has its own track, and we're following through on that, and we've diligently been pursuing a conclusion. And Alan can speak perhaps more on that process, that administrative process. And our charge is we strictly enforce our code. When it comes to our attention, we are making our best effort to address it, and we are currently evaluating that process in terms of being able to address what's on the books and to talk about its enforcement in light of the applications that were pending in that matter. Again, that's a separate issue. In addition, it was saying even with that issue, there's the risk to the historic district, and that's what before you now is, if there's a risk to the historic district, what's the antidote to preserving character but allowing infill development, which would help the community itself. They're conflicting goals. We want infill, but we also want to preserve the historic character. So I'd say on the former, we can give you an update on how that resolves itself, and we are actively pursuing it. And we should come to closure on that today, that matter, at least today on that specific application. In terms of the latter, that's the design part we're before you today on.
My general comment is, I mean, I'm very supportive of what you're wanting to attempt here, Rick. I think it's very appropriate for historic districts, but I guess I look at it from a much larger citywide perspective, and the issues that I think galvanized this work proposal the way it is could easily be done virtually anywhere in the city. And when we're talking about historic districts, I mean, I know what the York neighborhood or the Seaholm neighborhood looks like, and yeah, they're very historic in nature. But given the definitions of what a historic building is, it seems like the Ramblers of the 1960s and 70s, if they haven't already qualified, could qualify real soon. And yet we don't. I don't think we're going to be going ahead and trying to protect Rambler suburban type neighborhoods as much as we are looking at trying to preserve these much older neighborhoods, the way that I think this is actually being proposed.
I think there are two issues. One is overall bulk and dimensional issues throughout the community, and what's allowed and what's the maximum sizes, and is it still appropriate, considering changes that have occurred. And the second is in historic districts, you have a greater regulatory construct to alter envelopes and sizes to fit in. And that's because we value as a community the historic area itself. Why
wouldn't you do that anywhere in town, though? Because every neighborhood's going to eventually be historic.
Well, one can consider a broader application of bulk and dimensional. That's really looking overall at it. One can consider a context base. It's difficult to acknowledge the diversity of lot sizes we have and areas and try to come up with it would have to be almost a flexible scheme to deal with the various areas. If one was building on 5 acres, clearly there's less concern about size if one was building on 5,000 square feet. If that's the direction you wish to pursue, we could look more broadly at that, and that certainly would be an approach that could be used citywide. I was responding specifically to the historic context issue that was raised in the proposal before you.
Well, yeah, because I guess what I see is that we'll take care of these 3 neighborhoods through this type of effort, but the same thing could happen in Happy Valley, which doesn't have that historic nature,
Sunnyside.
and most likely would be the next target.
Leyland.
And that's the reason why I'm thinking that a citywide approach might be a better approach if we're going to go through this type of workload, to look at it as comprehensive as we can.
And I'm going to disagree with Jack on that for right now. I agree we need to take an overall look, particularly the boarding home rules part as we do that on a separate track. But I think there is a greater concern in the historic neighborhoods aren't just the potential of 3 neighborhoods, because you've got the South Hill neighborhood, you've got the Seaholm neighborhood, you've got the Columbia neighborhood, you've got the York neighborhood, and Sunnyland neighborhood, and they all have in common a couple things. One, they were established a long time ago. They have small lots on all of these neighborhoods, and they have certain kinds of different kinds of housing. But the key for me is they're almost all built out, and they have small lots, and so the size and other things do, I think, matter more in those neighborhoods than the newer neighborhoods that have 20,000 square foot lots, or some of the bigger lots that can handle different bulk and more different kinds of styles. So I would really prefer that we start with this, because I think those neighborhoods in particular are in danger of losing a lot of things regarding the character of it, of the buying up of the older homes and letting them deteriorate and, cost them all out through rentals, and then trying to put in the things that we've seen just over in the York now. So this current plan of at least getting started in phase 1 for me, I can support that. I think that's a good way to start, to do the inventory and other things. But in terms of the uses, illegal uses, and those kind of things, I think that of course has to be citywide. But I think I can support the way this is starting within the historic neighborhoods, and it is preservation for that. So that's.
So Terry, what I was proposing is not. It's not excluding the historic neighborhoods.
No,
really
I know
isn't. And so, taking your argument about square footage of lots, I guess I would go and key in on King Mountain, which is going to have extremely small lots as that's being developed. Does that qualify? Or should it qualify? I mean, eventually.
As historic?
Eventually, no. It's not an issue of whether it's historic or not. You're talking about the fact that it's small lots, and here you're having these large structures built on small lots. Mm-hmm. That's the argument I'm hearing from you. It doesn't have to deal with historic as much as it does with the size of the lot.
I think that we've got 2 elements going, because I keyed in on all those neighborhoods are in common. We have that much older historic quality and character of the neighborhood. Yes, it's going to be important that King Mountain develop a character of their own, whatever that character of King Mountain will be. Right now, King Mountain, the character of King Mountain is trees. And for me, I would love to preserve that whole thing. But in terms of a work assessment for our staff, mm-hmm. I think this is a good starting point.
So to be classified as a historic structure, is it 40 or 50 years? Do you recall either one?
See if Katie's here.
Kate,
50. Yeah, it's different in different, it depends on local register whether the state's usually 50 for state or others. And you're right, mid-century modern could qualify, though not all the Ramblers have historic provenance. There's a wide variety of, one of the things we need to acknowledge is just being old doesn't mean you have historic provenance or we have specific design. It has to be old with other characteristics. The unique part about some of the historic districts and residential districts in Bellingham is that we have a lot of the same kind of homes from the same period in pretty good shape. And that's where you can look at a broader district.
but that sounds like Ramblers
Yeah.
for that period.
Well, one would argue whether that was indicative of preservation.
I know, but,
doesn't make
40
merit.
years ago, you would be looking at buildings that were built in the 20s and 30s and say, well, that's what they were. And, fast forward 50 years, and we're looking at Ramblers in kind of the same way. So
It's interesting.
Yeah.
They're-
I'm not trying to support Ramblers, but I'm bringing it up because it is an issue. Well,
What I can say is it's interesting in that in preservation, when you get to the 50-year milestone, things like fast food restaurants are now
right.
being listed. Whether that's good or bad, we consider them historic in some cases. I would say that we believe, starting with the historic and working on those issues, deal with an immediate issue that has some risk. Whether that could be expanded over time, certainly to look at a citywide issue, but this is a first step.
The reason I'm bringing up the citywide issues is because I even look in my own neighborhood and some of the building that was going on in my neighborhood, and I brought this up in the past, that design standards for single-family homes, I think, is an important thing that we should be looking at for Bellingham. We have, it's not just the bulk and scale issue that you're talking about, but other design standard issues. I mean, you're talking about porches. Well, we don't have design standards for single family right now. We can regulate the hell out of ADUs or infill toolkit type of structures or multifamily. I mean, apartment buildings have a lot more regulation associated with them than single-family homes. And it just seems to me that if we're trying to preserve neighborhood character, and everybody's talking about trying to preserve neighborhood character, that we're kind of missing the boat when it comes to design standards for single-family. And I understand that that's not part of this effort here, but I really think that, I'm going to be taken off in a few months myself, but I guess I want to go and stress that I think that that's a very important thing that Bellingham should we really should be looking at.
Well, there is an outcome of this work that would affect that potential future work, and that the very first thing is you look for the hidden design standards in your existing regulations, meaning that what does our existing regulations, how does that affect the way a building looks and sits on land? That same envelope study would likely be the same starting point for this study too, and we'll learn from that. There's a good book that talks about the hidden design guidelines in zoning, because by a bunch of the things we do about setbacks, modulation, height, pitch, it shapes what the building envelopes can be. So we would be identifying that as a first step. And I hear the concern about design standards that could be applied more broadly.
With you were talking about floor height being somewhat equal within a block. Are you talking about everybody having 8-foot ceilings if 8-foot ceilings are the predominant and you can't have a 9-foot ceiling, or is it that you just can't have a 14-foot ceiling?
There are artful ways of doing it for new construction. It was trying to get the window lines to come up. That's part of character giving, that doors and windows tend to line up, that second stories line up. What you do inside the house is architectural license. You can create a lot of different spaces. It's the orientation of the windows, and so they read as supportive. The example would be if someone just built the maximum height, you have a stair stepping, and if continuity was the issue we're looking for, you lose that.
Okay.
So it would be freedom. The key is we want to ensure that folks have great architectural freedom on arranging their spaces, but they fit in and use a context-based system. The process here is how do we define what that context is? And then can we make sure you're going to fit in well? Buildings that would be new construction may not be trophy buildings per se, but they'll be elegant, contextually based buildings that fit in the neighborhood. Could be new materials, could be different means of construction, could be certain different ways of orientation, but they'd look like they would fit in.
My last question had to do, if you had 2 blocks in a historic district, you had 2 blocks, and the corner house is the subject property, are they then obligated to go and take the block that they are part of, or are they taking on both sides? Because, are you going to have one block look different than another block, but just because you're the corner lot on one block?
Yeah, typically we look at the block face for setback orientation, average lot width, average house width, but we look at the immediately adjacent homes on either side for context.
So it would go onto the other block as well?
Yeah,
Okay.
and that's not uncommon. That's a typical construct for these kind of rules. And the guidelines are, you could have guidelines that go with this that would encourage people to look, to try to match some of it, but not duplicate it. A challenge is that new construction that falsely replicates historic structures is not desirable. Yeah. You want it to be of its own time, but it could have a lot of nods to the historic context.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Dan?
I'm going to move that the development of Phase 1 standards be added to the Planning and Community Development Work Plan for 2016.
And I'll second that.
Can't. Okay. Any further discussion by anybody? Okay, seeing none. All those in favor of approving Phase 1 of the development regulations in draft form, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, we will bring that forward this evening. Thank you, Rick. This is very good first piece of work associated with this issue.
Good issues.
Appreciate it. Thank you. All right, with that, any other business for the Planning Committee?
Oh, I've got one thing for planning, and that relates actually to the hearing tonight. And just a question, if I could ask, probably. We're going to have the hearing tonight on the population studies, and we have in our packet, we have the Planning Commission's recommendations, and we have some of the parts of our planning department's recommendations. But there were 3 elements mentioned, choices to study, A, B, and C in terms of the recommendations. B and C are in this, and there were comments by the planning staff in terms of their recommendations that the preferences were for A or B, but A is not in the packet. At least I didn't see it. And so I wanted to be sure, did I miss that? And if it's not, could you get that to us?
Sure.
Because if our planning staff recommends that, we should look at that. Even though the Planning Commission might not have wanted it,
Sure.
I want to know what our staff was looking at and recommending, and because that's very important to me. So I wanted to, maybe I missed it when I was going through it.
I'll ask Greg to respond.
There is a map in your packet on page 45.
Uncle Greg.
Greg
how are you?
Ockett, Planning Department.
Okay.
There's a map on page 45 that summarizes alternative A, Terry, and I'll go over that tonight.
Okay. It's just the map. It didn't have the write-up.
Yeah, I'll go over it tonight for you.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure that we would get that as well, because I think, I want to hear what our staff has to say. Yeah, great.
Okay, and it's my understanding that we'll have the public hearing tonight, but we'll most likely take it into 1 or 2 work sessions? Is that what your anticipation is?
We would imagine. There'll probably be extensive comment tonight. You'll want to consider the comment and ask if there's any additional information you need from us based on the comment that was provided. We have a fairly good record, I do think, at this point, though.
Yeah, we have time reserved on the first meeting in August for a work session, and also the second meeting in August if it's needed.
Okay. Thanks for setting them up in August. All right. With that, I think we're going to be adjourned, and we'll see everybody at 1 o'clock. Thank you.